deserving parasitic poor people who are largely Black and brown. So it's an inherently patriarchal argument, inherently racist, inherently sort of chauvinistic, right? And it's mining white resentment and male resentment specifically at growing precarity, the feminization of work, and the loss of old ideas of masculine labor and power. And this also goes hand in hand with the declining power of America in the world, which also brings about another kind of anxiety at kind of a loss of identity and power. So I just want to end by saying that, you know, policy choices and research choices matter greatly. But, you know, we shouldn't rely only on what, you know, Khalil Muhammad would call statistical ghettos to make arguments for change. Stop that. So I think we should avoid neat narratives, particularly in this dangerous moment. We should understand the centrality of race and its broad and varied impacts, while we also seek to build new kinds of grounded affinity, right? The poor, the disabled, those in debt, those who are displaced, et cetera, those who are sick, and fuel those new kinds of affinity with a renewed sense of power to make change together. And so there's a danger, I think, that we're all flagging here in this webinar of reinforcing the dominant racial narrative by continuing to make invisible the profound, if more statistically challenging, human impacts of a system that serves the few at the expense of the many. And I just want to end with a quote from Barbara Smith, who is a Black feminist, lesbian, and activist. She said in 1984, sort of at the beginning of this neoliberal crisis, we are in a huge mishmash created by mad people at the top, and we are constantly trying to rectify the situation. I see the process of rectification as what Black feminism is all about, making a place on this globe that is fit for human life. And so our job as change makers in this very dangerous moment, I think, is to make the human sacred again. And, you know, numbers and statistics alone won't be enough. As you said, Jeremie, we're all here to try to figure out how to supplement those statistics with something else. Because, you know, after all, our cousins are far more numerous than we've been led to believe, right? So I will end there. Hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Soya. That was a lot for folks probably to take in, and maybe not what you're expecting in a conversation about data disaggregation, but I think super important to really understand that this is not just you know, a piece of legislation that we're trying to push or some annoying thing that you know, government agencies continue to do, but there is this broader context. So thank you, Soya. Seema is going to talk about some of the efforts at National Capacity to really try to make our communities more visible, and sort of the current state of some of the API data policy efforts. So Seema?
Thank you, and yes, thank you, Soya. I always love hearing you share the historical context of where we are today. So I'm going to share a little bit about capacity, and then some of the policy challenges we have been working on really since our inception. So National Capacity, as I explained in the beginning, we're a coalition of about 100 organizations across 21 states and the Pacific Islands. You know, our coalition primarily focuses on addressing the needs of what is now over 2 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders living in poverty in the U.S. That's probably an undercount, but that is the number we use. You know, and there's a reason we focus on those living in poverty, because it's really the only data we have available to us. So Asian Americans, here's a little bit of what we do know. You know, that it is the fastest growing racial group in the country, and is expected to double to over 47 million by 2060. This is an estimate from the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in 2016, I believe. You know, and the over 2 million number is really coming from the federal poverty data. That number is from 2014. You know, so this is the fastest growing poverty population as well as the fastest growing racial group. And like other communities of color, AAPIs also experienced a great amount of loss of wealth during the financial crisis, during the Great Recession. So between 2005 and 2009, Asian American net worth fell by 54%. And I'll talk a little bit about how I saw that play out in Queens, New York, where I was based during that time. So these charts on the bottom are really sort of, again, this is what we are able to pull out from the data that does exist about our community. And a lot of what National Capacity has been doing is trying to document community need ourselves. So we have done direct surveys through our member network to try to collect what isn't available to us. So that 35% on the lower left really just shows the change in the poverty population. It is the highest number of the other ethnic and racial groups, and that's over the past, between 2009 and 2014. And then this, on the right side, you can see it says cash is king. We did our own direct survey with community members and found that 74% of our community is still using cash primarily in their day-to-day transactions. So that's really among the low-income populations. So that really has a lot of implications in terms of how industry is shifting. You know, the industry is going more to financial technology, fintech. You know, and we're worried that our communities will be left behind as technology is used more and more for financial transactions. You know, and when you overlay cash with the number of people who are limited English proficient, it really leaves people vulnerable to predatory practices. So what we also know is that the vast majority of the low-income AAPI population is living in the top 10 metropolitan areas. So hence a lot of National Capacity's members are based in the major cities. That is where our low-income population is based for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part. So because of that, our communities are living in the highest cost markets, housing markets, as well as commercial. And so, you know, and also alongside other communities of color. And so the issue of displacement of our residents as well as small businesses is really a top priority issue for our National Capacity for that reason. We were being told that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were not impacted by the foreclosure crisis, and we knew very differently based on what we were seeing in our communities. And so this data is really what was put in place for financial regulators to report on lending. It's a requirement that's been there for a long time, but in 2015, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau updated the rule to include race and ethnicity data, and as well as age. And that was because it was very clear that communities of color were being targeted for predatory products, as well as seniors. You know, so having those data points of race and ethnicity as well as age are really important in order to be able to identify and predict trends in terms of where potential areas of risk are in our communities and where predatory products are being marketed. And so National Capacity was able to help lead the advocacy efforts to make that happen. You know, in Queens, for example, we were able to identify that more than 50% of owners, specifically South Asian and Indo-Caribbeans, were facing default at that time, even though the HMDA data was showing that AAPIs were not at risk. And so we were able to manually disaggregate the data and found that to be true. So that was really one of the major factors that convinced the CFPB that, okay, this is really something that we need to do. So unfortunately, that data will be collected for the first time this year. So we do expect to see the results of 2018. Moving forward, this is one of the things that the current administration and as well as Congress have been, unfortunately, repealing some of the wins that we gained in the last administration. This bill, the Senate Bill 2155, the Community Banking Bill, just passed both the Senate and the House. And what that does is it exempts 85% of lenders from reporting this data. So we'll still get the data from the larger financial institutions or the very large, but we were really disappointed that this passed both the Senate and the House. It is going to make it very difficult for us to be able to identify where riskier loans are being used by consumers, because really a lot of the predatory products were not, a lot of those were subprime loans that were being handled by smaller banks as well. So that is one issue that we are working on and monitoring. The second is the American Housing Survey. So this is a survey that is sponsored by HUD, but it's conducted by the Census Bureau. And it's really the most comprehensive national housing survey in the US. It's conducted biannually, and essentially the results of this survey determine how HUD's resources are distributed. It also impacts housing policy moving forward, and really will have a direct impact on how our communities are able to access support and investment. And so unfortunately that data also does not disaggregate. And so because our communities are living in high cost areas, it's very difficult to really see that in Jackson Heights, for example, Queens, there are also very low income families living alongside those that are wealthy. And so the overcrowding, as well as the fact that these communities are living alongside one another in sort of income diverse communities really hides, makes our communities more invisible. So in 2017, Secretary Castro of HUD committed to doing some more disaggregating of that data, as well as oversampling in low-income AAPI neighborhoods. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but we are going to keep pushing and moving forward. So just some other data priorities that I thought were worth mentioning. Of course, the census data, the issue of adding the citizenship question is really going to impact our communities. Many of our neighborhoods were already difficult to capture because of issues of immigration and enforcement, but also because of overcrowding. Large households living in small units was already very difficult to capture the number of residents in these communities, which of course impacts how resources are again distributed. Small business lending data, CFPB, that was the next set of data points that they were mandated to start developing and collecting, and so we're keeping an eye on that moving forward. And then of course OMB, the Office of Budget Management, there were efforts to ask them to also have more data disaggregated requirements in the data collection among all the federal agencies. That did not happen, but again, we'll continue to push with the administration. So lastly, I just wanted to share, if people are interested, on our website, we have poverty profiles of the top 25 MSAs. If you want to take a look at your region, you can see the breakdown of the poverty populations. So with that, I guess some of the recommendations that I wanted to make for researchers and others as other policy influencers is to really think about how to better include Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, understanding that it is very difficult to collect some of this data. I think even just acknowledging that the data is challenging to collect and mentioning our communities in research and sort of explaining why data wasn't available is important. Another thought is maybe just looking at low-income populations alone. and then breaking it down further from there is another strategy to use to be able to really show or better reflect the lower income parts of our population. And then, of course, join our advocacy efforts. You know, these data priorities are going to continue to be priorities for national capacity and many other organizations in the years down the line. So where there are opportunities to weigh in and support, we could really use additional advocacy efforts to push those through. And then, of course, partnering with entities like UCLA, as well as other research entities that have the capacity to dig a little deeper, you know, I think is another potential way to address these challenges. I will stop there.
Thank you, Seema. We'll be able to get more into some of these recommendations when we get through the presentations. Aujean.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks again for having me. I think my presentation will tie in really nicely to Soya's background on why framing is so important. And also it's great to hear Seema sharing a lot about some of the advocacy work that will tie into parts of my presentation. So my work generally examines residential segregation and impacts on racial disparities in homeownership, wealth, and community institutions. And I'm going to be running through some of the research that I've been involved with, along with the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA. And then, as Alicia noted, the slides will also be available to participants. So if I run through it also a little bit quickly, you'll also be able to access it offline after. So on the next slide, I just show some of the recent covers of the AAPI Nexus Journal. I'm going to be focusing on Nexus because it's one of the few academic journals that really focuses on publishing on Asian American Pacific Islanders, seeking to fill a lot of the gaps that folks have talked about in data, either by collecting or publishing articles that use primary or secondary data collection. And most of the authors are AAPI or their AAPI allies who are working to really frame the findings in a conscientious way. So on the next slide, actually, Melanie did a great article in a previous issue that was in conjunction with the White House Initiative on AAPIs. And this piece also summarizes, in addition to Seema's point, on other data sources that are available from the government, but have a lot of limitations in either examining citizenship or ethnic group differences. And this issue is available online and for free because of support with the White House Initiative. The next slide, this is the issue that I'll be focusing on. It's obviously relevant to our webinar today. So there's some key statistics I'd like to highlight from this issue. So Alicia actually did a great job putting together a few infographics that highlight some of the key findings. So this one here talks about homeownership. So homeownership is still the largest asset for most families of color, including Asian American Pacific Islanders. And this piece by Chandara Peck, Jenny Chia, and Paul Ong show some of the ethnic group variations that Southeast Asians and Filipinos hold the least amount in equity compared to some of the other populations. And that citizenship matters too. So those that are Chinese born or born in the US also have the highest amount of home equity. So this article goes on to explain how some of these cultural and immigration histories help to explain these distinctions. Those other folks mentioned that those who are immigrants also may not have credit history on the one hand, but also that some immigration laws have this preferential bias towards professionals who have more access to resources to buy homes. The next slide talks about how this over-reliance on housing was aggravated in the Great Recession. So Seema also talked about with the results of the foreclosure crisis, it was sometimes hard to access data that was focusing on Asian Pacific Islanders. So this article also talks about how those that were relying on housing for their main source of wealth, about a third of Asian immigrants lost their home equity with the recession. And it's important to think about, as also Seema mentioned too, that some of the regulations that were passed with the Dodd-Frank Act to protect homeowners and against predatory lending is on the chopping block. so it's important for us to think about how we can support advocacy efforts to maintain these protections. The next slide talks about, this is an article that I published that's using more qualitative data, so it's important to think about how do we supplement the secondary data that's available from different government or other entities. So this article, I talk about more of the organizational components where a lot of the Asian American Pacific Islander nonprofits are important to help with asset building, yet they're also being sometimes penalized because they are serving clients to take more time because of language needs. And so they're not necessarily as, they're less sometimes more in a disadvantaged state than other larger mainstream nonprofits that aren't serving these clients. And so they experience some additional challenges with perhaps meeting client quotas that are mandated from funders. The next slide here is part of a series of reports that the UCLA Asian Work Studies Center published with support from the Ford Foundation. So here, this report talks a lot more in depth about homeowner experiences during the foreclosure crisis. And I believe more additional information will be available in the next webinar on June 7th. So please come back for that to hear more from one of the authors of this report. And the next image is just showing a list of the other reports that are available. So again, the links are on the slides, or I think there's a link at the end to show some of the other, but it covers the range number of reports that they've been publishing over the last several years. On the next slide of the color wealth talks about the National Asset Scorecard for communities of color. So this is an initiative that some researchers did with UCLA and Ford to address some of the severe limitations in collecting secondary data on different ethnic groups. So this data set helped to really gather a lot more nuanced information on different types of wealth. So in the next slide, this shows an example of how essentially most data sources right now collect information on income, but they don't have specific indicators of wealth. So NASC is one of the sources that now has information on things like retirement. So as this graph shows, or this infographic shows, for example, that Japanese are the most likely to have an IRA account, while Koreans and Vietnamese have the lowest percentages that would have an IRA account. So these are important to think about as supplements to income, kind of more long-term based ways that we think about wealth. Pacific Islanders in particular, there's a lot of challenges with data. So this is just a brief article that I had put together that shows, I used census data on income, and then I controlled for different household characteristics to show that there are still these persistent income disparities. I didn't have wealth indicators because census data doesn't really have that. But what I was trying to show through this article was that there are some nuances that you can get when you include more qualitative data like oral history. So it's showing how we can inform better data collection efforts from these government agencies by learning more about how the way they talk about socioeconomic indicators may be different. So for example, I talk about how citizenship is thought about differently because there's different types of citizenship status among Pacific Islanders, and that household formation is different too. So ways we can think about being more nuanced in our questions in these larger national surveys. And this is just a quick slide that's also talking about efforts in California. It'd be great to hear other folks' sharing experiences or questions on some of these more advocacy efforts. But essentially that to create more sustainable efforts to get more nuanced data, one venue would be to have more public agencies required to collect some of this data. So Seema already went over some of the housing data sources. In California, there's been efforts for health, education, to also have more groups that are available so that researchers and community groups can access that and really understand the needs. The U.S. Department of Ed also launched in 2016 a $1 million campaign to help with AAPI data disaggregation efforts. And the last slide here just shows some of the links, again, to purchase if you're interested in the Nexus. And then also, you can look through the early slides again if you're interested in some of the reports that are available for free. Look forward to your questions and discussions, and I'll end my presentation here. Thank you.
Awesome, that was great. Thank you, Aujean. So when we talk about the complaint used to be that there was no data about APIs, and then there was the complaint that we have to disaggregate. And so I think that today we wanted to just it wasn't really that either or. It's like we have actually a lot of data, really kind of thinking about when we have it, how do we present it, and how do we sort of forge stronger collaboration partnership with organizations like Prosperity Now. So I'll turn it over to Jeremie, and Jeremie has been, I've known him even before Prosperity Now, and Prosperity Now actually, well, Jeremie, you can talk about that. You guys have gone through a name change, it used to be CFED. It's a challenge. I think that a lot of organizations, advocacy groups who worked with national capacity, continue to work with national capacity, have wanted to do the right thing, but there have been challenges. So it'd be great to just hear, from Jeremie. Thanks for joining us. What some of the challenges have been, and maybe some ideas on how we work together in the future.
Yeah, so we're really driving forward an agenda on closing the racial wealth divide, and the way that we enter into these conversations always is we want to stand behind strong data and create a good frame that drives home a story about that data. So we did that over the last 3 years with 2 major reports, one called The Ever-Growing Gap and one called A Road to Zero. And in those 2 reports, it really paints a really stark picture about wealth inequality for Blacks and Latino families. The data was robust, the data is there, and when you read it, you can't refute that there's a problem that the country must address. And as Sonia talked about, there's a historical context that you can connect to that shapes that story. What stopped us in our tracks was we went in there like, we're going to do this about all households of color. We're going to do this type of report, and we're going to include all households of color, API, Native, all of it. And what we found was we can't use the data in this way to tell that story that we know exists. Because the data that was there, as we talked about, is that, one would say, well, Asians are doing fine. And we didn't want to get into a conversation about a report and have to answer to a reporter, well, Asians are doing fine. Why can't Blacks be like Asians? Because that's not the conversation to have. So what we ended up doing was, instead of reporting out the data, we created some context within the report saying, well, we're not reporting out these data about API because we don't feel like it tells the full story and the full picture, and here's why. And then we cited Melanie and UCLA, and Derek and Sandy. We cited the CAP report that talks about inequality within the API community, where there's greater wealth inequality within the API than you even see in white households, where there's very wealthy and very poor. So we had to address it in that way. The other thing that we struggle with is we have an annual scorecard that we put out every year. We put out this annual scorecard. It's got robust data about wealth inequality in the country. We disaggregated by race. We have Black, Latino, and we have Asian. And we use the SIP. It's called the Survey for Income and Program Participation, which is the most robust survey about wealth that the federal government has, the big public data source. And the struggle we have there, and the number is really twofold in reporting out the data. One, they asked basically the racial groups that they account for are white, Black, Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, or Pacific Islander are the categories. It doesn't disaggregate beyond that. Doesn't ask the question beyond that. And we know that you have to break it down more. The second problem is, even for some of those groups that we have, there's basically 40,000 households in the SIP that are surveyed to get that report. even at that level, you can't disaggregate to make generalizations about a lot of the populations that are in that report, in that survey. And in a lot of places, you can't make generalized statements about API. So I say all that because what I think that we have to do is there has to be twofold. One, we have to fill the gap, right? The government, we can't expect to do anything, so we have to fill the gap with something. And I think this should be a call to philanthropy. Philanthropy should come to the table and really try to fund the researchers that are in this space. And the Ford Foundation did this. This is how we got the scorecard on households of color that Derek, Sandy, and Melanie have been connected to. So we can have real robust research and data that allows us to tell the story in a full way about all the communities of color that we serve. But as we do that, we still have to advocate to get the public data that is going to allow us to do this over the long term. Those philanthropy, those are very expensive studies, and philanthropy is only going to be able to do so much of that. And it should be the responsibility of our government to provide that data for people. Now, the political debate around the data isn't just about the data. It is also about the policies that underlie the data. Seema talked about the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. There's political reasons and policy reasons on why they make these changes. You can't enforce fair housing if you don't have the data to enforce fair housing. You can't enforce employment discrimination if you don't have the data to enforce employment discrimination. So we can't step away from the need to advocate for disaggregated questioning and surveys, as well as robust data that oversamples communities so that we can get a full picture of those communities. We still have to do that advocacy, because if we don't, we're going to lose the policy debates that a lot of that data supports. So I'm going to stop there because I know that we want to get to some questions.
Thank you, Jeremie. That was a great, wide-ranging conversation, I think, on all of the different pieces of the data policy and AAPIs. And so we do have this one question from the audience about specific programs or policies that are attempting to close the gap for wealth inequality for AAPIs and for communities of color. So maybe Seema and Jeremie, you both could talk about that.
So national capacities programs, we, most of our service programs and re-granting really focus on addressing the wealth gap, so not just income supplements, although that's a piece of it. There's also the housing work itself, making sure people are able to maintain their homes. So even preventing displacement in and of itself, we see it as a part of our overall strategy to help our communities build wealth. The home ownership program, of course, is a major program and still the primary way Americans are able to build wealth in this country. The challenge is that they are still, most of our communities living in these high cost areas. And so home ownership is nearly impossible for many. But we are continuing to push on that area as well. And we are able to successfully help many people buy homes through a whole set of housing programs. And then, of course, we have these peer lending circles that we administer in partnership with the Mission Asset Fund. So for those who have very little credit or very little savings, this is really the best way to get started. It's essentially a group of people pooling resources and building credit at the same time, building savings to put towards something like an educational investment. And then, of course, there are programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit. But I do think we need bolder solutions and much more systemic approaches to addressing the racial wealth gap. I think a lot of these programs, they will take time. People will need to build over years, and what we really need in this country is a much more comprehensive approach to the issue.
Yeah, I'll answer two ways, and one's a challenge to philanthropy, one be a challenge to government. I think with philanthropy, we need to have a real discussion about what capacity building means when it comes to organizations of color. I think too often the answer to people's capacity concerns is to send in a trainer to train them for 2 days. And this real challenges. What are the things that you're struggling with day to day in serving your communities, and then work with them to find solutions so we can really build a robust network of organizations that are led by people of color in communities that they serve. I think that's my big challenge to philanthropy. The other thing I think around public policy is we need to stop creating policies in which we are telling communities what they should and should not do, and why the earned income tax credit is such a powerful policy solution is because it doesn't do that. It basically says, you're low income, you're a wage earner, we're going to give you money, spend it how you need to. And that is something that we as a government, we're not going to begin to solve any of these problems unless our government starts to really support families and get out of their way.
Okay, great. We have one other question. They wanted to hear more about, from the panelists, about initiatives like community development credit unions. So I don't know if you also want to talk about that. And then I would also just cue Seema also to talk about the anti-displacement work, because if that may not be individual asset building, but I think it's about community asset preservation in a way. So maybe those two things, something about community CDFIs. And then I also wanted to bring Aujean and Soya into the conversation if you have any additional thoughts. But Seema, do you want to take CDFIs?
Sure. I mean, I think, just before I jump into the credit union model, I think, one thing that we need to address is that, many of communities of color don't have this generational wealth that is passed on. And so in designing a lot of these public programs, we need to acknowledge that that doesn't exist and really make up for it, right? So programs like a down payment assistance program, they really have to be aggressive enough that they can support families who don't have generational wealth to help with the initial down payment, things like that. So I think, thinking about intergenerational approaches to wealth building is really a critical part of the strategy. But in terms of CDFIs, I think those are great models, keeping money in the community overall. National Capacity is doing some work around intergenerational approaches to asset building. And, really the model that we highlight in our Foundations for the Future report focuses on the Native Hawaiian community and how, wealth building is really thought of in terms of community and not individual and or family. And so strategies using partnerships with credit unions is really an excellent way to make sure that money stays in the community and not just, a loan with an interest rate, but it's really owned by the community itself. In terms of the anti-displacement work that we're doing, I'd say one of the most exciting things that's happening right now across the country are the land trust and land banking models that are occurring all over the country, really. I met somebody just yesterday from Minneapolis who was involved in a land bank and in the south side of Chicago. So, even in these urban areas where it feels like land is very limited, there are efforts to not only gain control of the land, but keep it affordable for generations, really. So the idea of that is to stabilize the housing and the community land so that people can build wealth, and when they leave, it goes to another family who's able to build wealth, So those are some of the most innovative approaches that are being used today that are very impactful.
I heard that Alicia needs, thank you, Seema. I heard that, I'm sorry, I'm reading the the screens, that Aujean needs to leave. So Aujean, do you want to just make a few final comments or address any of the questions that came up?
I think, sorry, folks, I have to leave a little bit early. I'm in the middle of traveling, but thanks so much for having me. And I put my email address on an updated version of PowerPoint, which Alicia will be disseminating. But I think it's important to also think about ways that academics can partner with CBOs. Part of the different timelines with research is that academic research usually takes a lot longer. So folks that I've worked with, we hope to try to make more robust research available, especially with community partners. But I think other folks can talk more directly about specific programs that they're working on. So thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Aujean. Soya, did you want to jump in at all?
Well, I'm a little out of my depth, but I guess I have questions more than answers to the questions that folks have asked. I love always hearing about community land trusts and credit unions and those kinds of projects, and I'm always curious about people, like the people on this panel, your thoughts about how to get those kinds of projects to scale. And then also I think about what's going on right now politically, and so many of the kinds of policies I've heard talked about are at the federal level, and we're now at in a position where, you know, the far right has basically won both the executive and legislative branches and the Supreme Court, and so, you know, or at least, you know, yeah, the right has won the Supreme Court, and so I wonder about other levers of power, like at the state level and municipal level, and sort of what the policy landscape looks like there in terms of opportunities and challenges. I mean, obviously, many states also have gone red and deep red, but just curious about other levels of government.
Yes, absolutely. Seema or Jeremie, do you want to tackle that? I mean, I was actually going to say that that was also a question that I had. You know, here in California, we have something called the California Health Interview Study, which from its original design oversamples AAPIs, and it's built in and baked into the methodology because a really kick-ass Filipina, Asian American
when they do those kind of across the state studies, they go into down to the census tract level of data collection. So those can be very powerful, and you know, states are an entity that has the money to pay for a study like that. So to the extent that, you know, the census isn't going to change, the Federal Reserve Board isn't going to change, you can do a lot at the state level to learn a lot, and use it to push the state to institute policies that are going to really target communities. So I definitely agree that pushing at the state level is an avenue that everyone should pursue.
Yeah, we actually had a question specifically about Connecticut. Are you doing any work in Connecticut, Jeremie?
We have in the past, not at the moment, but we've done some work. We actually did a tax policy scorecard a few years ago in Connecticut with the budget office, with the National Partnership state budget office there, and there's a lot that can be done. Yeah, so we've worked in Connecticut. And if that person, I think our contact information is available through this webinar, wants to reach out to me and talk about Connecticut, I'm happy to talk to them.
Okay. So they were saying that they're in Connecticut. Connecticut is one of the places that I was referring to about where Chinese Americans are actively lobbying the state to remove pyramids to disaggregate state data. So, you know, it's not just about proactively pushing, but it's actually doing some deep.
My it's just, I think, Lisa, you said this in the beginning, this is wedge politics. It's a way to try to drive divisions within communities of color, because, you know, what they're really afraid of is the policies that can come out of the data if it's collected. So if we don't collect the data, if we don't collect data on housing, we don't have to have a conversation about fair housing. So again, I just believe it's a wedge, and one of the best ways to address it is to maybe just call it what it is.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, one of the things that I hope is that we can have eyes and ears that are not API folks, but also API folks, you know, when we are, you know, seeing things like that pop up. I think it is the elite in our community, right? So the folks who want and benefit from this model minority, right? The fact that all Asians are wealthy. If they're a business person, then, you know, maybe they'll have more opportunities. And so they have a self-interest in promoting that narrative, right? So, but it would be great if folks who hear about initiatives like that can call on national capacity, on research partners, and on Prosperity Now and organizing groups to really beat that back. Because it's dangerous. So, Seema, did you want to say more?
Well, you know, just that this, that, you know, more conservative voice has emerged in a number of places that Capacity has been working, including at the CFPB around the HMDA data. And their voices are quite loud. And so I think, you know, one, it's very important that we make sure our voices are louder and, you know, make sure that we are challenging those positions in a very public way, because they are well organized. And then the other thing is, I know that the Grassroots Asian Rising is the GAR coalition is planning or doing work around addressing this issue. And so if those issues pop up, I would encourage folks to reach out to that coalition, because I think they are actively looking at this issue.
Absolutely. So there's a couple of other questions here. Who are the crazy rich Asians? And where did they come from? No. And the other question is about the role of worker cooperatives in building community wealth.
Well, the worker cooperatives, I will say, are, you know, again, what a really great strategy. I think, you know, co-ops, cooperative worker models, you know, cooperative homeownership, really, it gives the power back to community in terms of ownership, and are really, if we could, the challenge has been bringing those models to scale. I think there have been a few really successful models. You know, Rock Restaurant Opportunity Centers one, I think, was one of the first ones to really go to scale, and is very successful. But I think that has been the challenge of really moving the worker cooperative model, is that it's challenging to take it to scale. So it really requires a lot of local investment and communities to really do a lot of work in building it out. But it is, in many ways, I think, the answer to really shifting wealth back to communities. Yeah. In terms of who the crazy rich Asians are, you know, I know some of them. I'm just kidding. You know, it's important that we do acknowledge those parts of our communities as well, not the crazy part, but the rich part, you know, that we do have many people. You know, I worked in New York for 20 years, and the Wall Street Asian community is very powerful and an important part of the economy. So it's not to say that they don't exist. It's just that we need to make sure that the full diversity of our community is acknowledged.
And also, I don't think that we can concede that they are all conservative either. So, Soya, do you want to say more on that?
I'm not sure what you're looking for, but
no, just, I mean, just this a piece around selective immigration policy, right?
Sure. I mean, you know, this again is a kind of historical question of how these changes came about, in what context and why. You know, the 1965 Immigration Act was really the, you know, end of racial quotas, and that would not have been possible without the civil rights movement, without the other the whole conjuncture of that time. And at the same time, you know, the 65 Act gets celebrated a lot, right, in terms of this this new era in immigration policy that was more inclusive. It's also the first act that starts to criminalize immigration from in the Western Hemisphere, from Latin America. And so at the same time that it's creating these pathways into inclusion in the United States for Asians, it's also creating new forms of criminalization in immigration policy. And then, of course, we see things like IRCA in the 80s, and then, you know, the 96 laws, and it's sort of this creeping and then sweeping kind of changes to criminalize huge segments of migrant populations in a very racialized way. And so I think, you know, the other thing about the Asian American population I just wanted to say is that, you know, it does matter kind of when and how people kind of arrive in the country and what is happening at that time, you know. So just because these selective immigration policies started to form doesn't mean that you now have a prosperous Asian American population. We know that that's not true, because these other kinds of structural you know, racialized, exploitative kind of systems are still in existence. You know, for example, Filipino migrant workers are, you know, the export. Robin Rodriguez wrote a great book called Migrants for Export that talks about the role of the Filipino domestic worker in the global economy. And so there's still very much, you know, a low-wage labor exploitative system that's going on. That's not just Asian, but, you know, continues to kind of shape that polarization within that demographic category, right?
And certainly there's a distancing from amongst different generations of Asians, and really trying to, you know, not be affiliated with whether it be refugees or the workers. We're not like them, right? There is, I think, that too, that some of us have even heard within our own families. So yeah.
That's the coercive power of the racial bribe that has formed, you know, shaped this country from the get-go. I mean, it's the coercive power of whiteness, of capitalism, of race, you know, racism, all of these. So
I don't think you talked about.
And there's an element of that in all communities. There's that in Black communities, Latino communities. All communities have an element of that they have to work on within the community. So that's not something that is special or specific to Asians. It's work we all do.
But, you know, the line about our cousins are more numerous than we are taught to believe, it is sort of that. If that's true, and it is true, right, then shouldn't our cousins be those who are actually trying to push back against that, or people who are actually struggling kind of in the system that creates that kind of coercion, you know? I think it's kind of trying to find ways to come together around some of that stuff.
So we are going to try to wrap up. It's been a super rich conversation. I will say that this is a teaser to 2 additional webinars that we're going to be hosting. And also we're going to do this sort of live and in person at the National Capacity Convention. Jeremie's going to be joining us. Soya, I don't know if you're going to the convention, but if you are, please.
We love to have you.
Going to be in Atlanta this year, so it is a series that we're trying to, you know, to dig into. So, you know, there's not an easy answer. I think that there are many actions that we had that have come up throughout this webinar, and that you know, I certainly have been taking notes, and we can certainly share that with the participants, and maybe do a slide in the PowerPoints that we attached to this recording. But there's a lot of actions I think that we need to stick together on the advocacy work and really collaborate, as opposed to just having AAPIs working on AAPI data issues. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And I think that there's a lot of room for collaboration with researchers and academic institutions to continue to build the case about, you know, I think that the smaller local specific studies and ethnic specific studies continue to build the case for the need for data disaggregation in bigger data sets, whether they be at the state level or at the federal level. And of course, there's lots of programs and lots of innovations that are happening that Seema mentioned lots of tools around solidarity economies and credit unions and land trusts, and for individual wealth building that National Capacity and its members do every day. And of course, there's the organizing groups are represented with Grassroots Asians Rising and a lot of the groups that Soya is connected to. And of course, I think this is not just a technical exercise, it's also understanding the politics and having that deeper analysis. I really appreciate you, Soya. So any last words? Otherwise, we'll wrap up and close out. Soya, Jeremie, Seema?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, very grateful to everyone who's doing this difficult work.
Yeah, we had upwards of 70 people on the webinar, so it's really great. Thank you everyone for joining. And I'll just say thank you again to the Ford Foundation and to National Capacity for partnering with us on this, and Change Lab and Prosperity Now. We really appreciate you all, and to UCLA. Thank you all very much, and we will hopefully see you on the next webinar. It's going to be on housing counseling on Thursday, June 7th, next week. So thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.